Okay, welcome everybody. This is our fourth session in the letter to the Romans. And we're going to be focusing today on chapter 3. So if you have scriptures, you can open to chapter 3. And we'll be looking to unpack these dense chapters of Paul's. You know, they're very difficult to get at the heart of, as we've been saying all along. But these are some of the vital aspects of our thinking. They go deeply into our understanding as Jews of the meaning of the gospel. And I think that the meaning of the gospel sometimes gets obscured because some of these things are misunderstood. And I just on a personal note, this week I've been, I mentioned it in my sermon that I've been listening to some very important theologians in regard to Paul, and it's almost breathtaking, the lack of understanding that, from my point of view, that they have. And these are people who are the most influential scholars in Christian thought. I mean, guys like, in this case, D.A. Carson, who's doing an exposition of Galatians and Romans that just took my breath away. Because there are things that they say that, how do you account for some of the things that these guys then did in their life? As an example, just because I know I'm talking obscurities here, but to give you a concrete example, the issue laid out for us in Galatians chapter 2, in which there are Jews and Gentiles eating together, and then some men from James come to the congregation at Antioch, and Peter and Barnabas and some of the other Jewish members of the community get up and walk away, refuse then to eat with the Gentiles in the group. And he talked about it as that they wouldn't eat with them because they were eating non-kosher food, and now that these guys came from Jerusalem, they were embarrassed, so they stopped eating it. Non-kosher food. Okay, so now, how do you explain, if in other words, if Paul was eating non-kosher food, how do you explain that at the end of the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 28, when this is his last trip, because he's going to be executed by Nero very shortly, after the events of chapter 28 in Romans, that Paul, when he gets there, calls the Jewish community together. I'm talking about the leadership of the Jewish community of Rome, not the Christian Jews, not the believing Jews, the Jewish community of Rome. He calls them up, asks them to come to see him. They come. And there, in his own words, I will say his own words so that nobody thinks I'm misquoting. He says this: after 3 days, Paul called together those who were the leading men of the Jews. And when they came together, he began to say to them, "Brethren, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans." Now, if he said to these Jewish people, he's done nothing against his people or against the customs, what does it say? The customs of our fathers. Are you trying to tell me that he lied to these people? Because he used to, if I'm in Antioch, I'm eating pork sandwiches. It's not about food. If nothing about that incident is about food, nothing. And yet we're talking about some of the top scholars, and this is how they address the issues. I mean, it's breathtaking. Yeah, to think. Yeah, again, but he explained what his vision was. Yeah, I know. This is the problem that you get locked in. Understand something about scholarship. I'm all for scholarship. I really am. I'm all for advanced degrees and studying real hard and understanding. I'm really for it. But sometimes it can become a stumbling block to understanding, to enlightenment. It really can, because you get locked into things and you can't break out of them. You can't break out of your system. Did you want to say something, Deborah, before we go on, because we have a lot to cover?
I just wanted to Colossians 2 in that context. What you're sharing about with Paul, and what the lens that he was using to sort of interpret those kinds of dynamics, whether it be food or Sabbaths or festivals.
Let me explain something to you about those special. Yeah, and understand something. No group of people had more holy days than the Romans. Okay, so he wasn't just talking to Jews when he was saying special days, this, that, and the other thing. One day guy honors a day more than another. Blah 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 blah. He was talking to everybody, because the Romans have a holiday every day.
But you have to understand that Paul never teach against Torah.
Exactly.
Wherever Paul teach against, he in Colossians chapter 2, he teaches against Gnostics, which was accusing the Jewish people and new believers how they celebrate Shabbat, how they eat food, and everything.
Yeah.
And also in a context of the New Testament scriptures, there's no pork there at all.
Yeah.
Because it was written by Jewish people to the believers, which is mostly the Jewish people.
Yeah.
So definition of the food, it's a definition what God gave us in Leviticus chapter 11.
Right.
And it's the definition of food.
Right.
Everything is, somebody inserted pigs there, somebody inserted Shabbos there. In the Romans, same ideas. In Romans chapter 14, and he's absolutely not talking about Shabbos or absorbing a moed. He's talking about when the arguments was, when I fasting, it's what about food. I eat or not eat in this day or in this day.
Right.
So that when people took out of context some scriptures of the Paul, which is Peter predictably said in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 14, and later, he said, as Paul wrote in his teachings, in his scriptures, which is unstable and unlearned people twisted for what? For what purpose? For distractions. You see, there's teachings existed in Christianity today, the mainstream of Christianity doctrines, teaching about false doctrine, twisted scriptures of the Paul, and lead the people, most of the believers, into destruction under the curse. Because Torah is the blessings. We read last time we studied about the Torah. Torah is purpose of the given the law. It's to bless people.
Right.
To give them the blessings. It's a main purpose. And the people, devil don't like for God's people to be blessed.
But the scripture literally says, so let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is Christ.
So
that's what I understand it as what it literally says. I'm taking a literal interpretation of that verse.
Okay.
I'm not
literal interpretation of this verse. I will explain.
Okay.
To you.
Well, we're not studying Colossians right now. We'll get, let's. You're right. And at the end of Romans, he deals with some of these same subjects, so we'll get a chance. Let's get back into chapter 3. I want to clean some of this up. Okay. Last week when we stopped speaking about this, when we ended our session the week before, we were discussing what the purpose of Torah is, because we remember that there's this portion in chapter 3 in which it says, what was it? I think it's verse. Where was it? Oh yeah, here it is, verse 20. Excuse me. So by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin. We were discussing this sentence because of its impact on traditional thinking throughout the years. That somehow this means that this is the very purpose of Torah. This is what God gave the Torah for, in order to explain to us all how utterly sinful we are. So he gave us this example, and of course you can use you can justify it by the whole Torah, the whole Hebrew scriptures, how they just failed time after time after time, and this was the whole purpose of it. So God just ragged on the Jewish people for centuries just in order to make an example out of them, right? To show how human beings can't possibly obey the Torah, and I think we disproved that. Yeah. That the Torah serves the purposes for which God originally gave it. One, to provide a place for him to occupy, to be there in the midst of his people, right? What were the things we said?
The constitution of the kingdom.
Right.
Comes into Israel was saved, not because they followed the Torah. They was saved to receive the Torah from God, for purposes to be God's people, right. By observing the right. Torah, and to be. Right.
So I just want to summarize this so we can move on. So that Israel is to be a kingdom, a priest, and a holy nation. That through Israel, God would be able to dwell among mankind. Moreover, Israel would mediate the relationship between God and all mankind by being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. In order that they would have to be, in order to do that, they would have to be a holy nation, maintaining holiness in the people, the priesthood, especially the land, and especially in the Mishkan, right? So this was how God would be able to dwell in the midst of his people. This was the primary purpose of the giving of most of the Levitical law, okay? Secondly, the Torah would establish a standard whereby all humanity would be drawn to the light and image of God. In other words, what does it mean to be a human being? What it means to be a human being is to act in these ways. And you take the 10 Commandments and some of the other moral aspects of the law. Thou shalt not kill or steal, you don't lie, you treat your neighbor kindly, all kinds of other things that we can extrapolate from Torah. This is what it's meant to be, and it's meant to draw other human beings to the light of God. And by the way, this was exactly what drew people to the light of God in the time of Yeshua, Gentiles, I mean, and why many Gentiles converted to Judaism in those days. Because they saw, in comparison to their own degraded religions, the beauty of the humanity of the Torah. Okay? And thirdly, the Torah was given that it might be the vehicle of God's blessing to his people Israel. Remember the blessings and curses of Deuteronomy 27, 28. If you do these things, I'm going to mediate my blessing to you in and through your doing of Torah. You do these things, your enemies will run from you. You'll be fruitful. The land will have it, you'll stay in the land. You'll have everything you ever needed. God will give you a blessed life, and so on. And that works to this very day. If you're obedient to the Torah, you can expect good things from God. Okay?
In the book of Deuteronomy.
Michael, I know what you're going to say. Okay? And the Holy Spirit is, of course, necessary. I'm not getting past that.
The Torah didn't appear in a vacuum. The Torah had to be there. God doesn't work in a vacuum. So the Torah was the foundation for Yeshua to enter the world.
Okay, I'll buy that.
Torah, you wouldn't need a Messiah. You wouldn't.
No, but we're going to get to that.
Purpose of it.
Absolutely.
So that's
You see,
not just the purpose.
agreed. No, but you see, I never said salvation is available through the Torah, because it's not. There's only one way to salvation.
Right.
That's through Messiah. Okay, that's through Messiah. What I didn't say any of those other things. I said what God said in Tanakh. In Tanakh, I'll dwell with you. I'll bless you through these things, and the nations will be drawn to you through these things.
Actually, Torah never teach about salvation at all.
Yeah, I know.
Because Torah is not the
Okay,
salvation.
everybody recall that, I want you to listen to me carefully. That I did not say that salvation is available through the Torah. It's a foundation, because upon it God builds his kingdom. There's no question about that. But the essential part of salvation comes through the Messiah. Okay?
Actually,
So,
Okay, wait a minute. We
I
have a
thought
teacher
that- I thought
here.
That the Torah is to point us to Yeshua Christ. I thought that was the whole purpose.
no, it's not the whole purpose. No. See, this is where everybody gets tied up. Everybody gets tied up. Okay, all right, and I'm going to answer the question. And I'm going to answer the question. It's not the whole thing. Okay, I just explained. I'm going to tell you why it's not the whole thing. Because if it is the whole thing, then there's no need for Jews now. None. We should have all been taken care of in the Holocaust, because there's no need for us. Because that's what it would mean. It means that the promises that God made in 2/3 of his word are meaningless. Meaningless. If all that it is it's supposed to lead us to one Jew. It's not. That's not the purpose of Torah. It's a purpose that we would be led to the Messiah. It's a purpose, but not the whole picture. So let's try to get the whole picture in there, not just zero in on one thing.
The Torah pointed, because he came in the volume of the book, the Torah, and it was written of him, and it pointed to him, and they didn't receive him.
Well, that's true.
I don't understand if the purpose is not.
Look, Messiah Yeshua identified the problem himself. He said to some people one time, you search the scriptures because you think in them you have eternal life, and you're unwilling to turn to me that you would have it. Okay? Right, because the Torah is not for that. You see, they were. Well, look, I agree that he is the living word.
He is the
Okay, yeah. But the written word has meaning too.
he is the only door
He's the
into the kingdom.
manifestation. He's
Right.
the
Yeah. Okay. All right, everybody.
Bring to the
I'm gonna.
Messiah Yeshua.
Okay. Look.
So you
He's
enter
he's
into the
everything.
Torah, into relationship.
Okay.
Folks. I'm the teacher here. If you think that I'm wrong, I'll entertain your ideas another time. But let's get through some of this. What I do not need here is traditional Reform Christian thinking, because if that's where you're locked into, you're going to have a very hard time with what I'm teaching. You're going to have a really hard time. Martin Luther was not the prophet, and we got to get off of that. John Calvin was not the prophet. Both of those guys had a lot of things wrong, particularly if you're coming from the point of view that God's covenants with Israel are eternal, that the first believers in Messiah Yeshua did not abandon Torah because they thought it was outdated and because they had Yeshua now, so they could just throw it away. But they never said that. You won't find it. I defy anybody to show me how that works out in the New Testament. So let's try to understand this from this point of view, that God and his covenants with Israel are eternal. The Torah is eternal. It does not nullify the Messiah or diminish him in any way. Okay? Let's start there. That's my starting point, and I hope it can be yours. Now, having said that, we gave the purpose of the covenant at Sinai. So that God,
Rabbi, can I say something?
sure.
Out here in Columbus, we're sitting back and listening to the fight out there, and we are saying to ourselves, we want to hear what you have to say. We really don't want to listen to an argument.
Okay. All right.
Us here too.
All right. So let's go on. All right. So let's pick it up in verse 2, chapter 2, verse no, I'm sorry, chapter 3, excuse me. So that chapter 3, verse 20, we talked about the law. All right, so now, verse 21 and following. All right, so verse 21 reads, but now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. Okay, even the righteousness of God through faith in Messiah Yeshua, for all those who believe, for there's no distinction, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, being justified as a gift by his grace through the redemption which is in Messiah Yeshua. Now, so here we have to explain terminology, all right? Here is where I think there come a lot of issues, a lot of problems. And because whenever you're discussing something, terminology is very important, right? I mean, if you're ever in a debate class, the first thing you have to do is define your terms. Because if people don't understand what you mean by a word, then forget about the argument. You're not going to be able to convince anybody of anything, right? So let's talk about some words. So he said, now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. Now, what did we say in earlier classes? The righteousness of God, how have we defined this term, the righteousness of God? How have we defined it? Anybody?
God fulfills his promises.
Correct. God is the promise keeper. This is the righteousness of God, that he says something and he makes it so. He fulfills it. We also said that the righteousness of God is not dependent on the goodness or the righteousness of people. Let God be faithful, though every man be a liar. Right? God is faithful to the promises that he made, no matter whether or not we're obedient to those things or not. See, what Paul is trying to say in this argument, which he could have said in 15 seconds if he had wanted to, was all people have demonstrated themselves to be unfaithful. But that doesn't matter to God, because God is going to be faithful to the promises that he made, first to Israel and then to the world. Because everything that all these arguments go back to Abraham and the promises that God made to Abraham regarding Abraham himself, his family, and the rest of the world. This is what it's all about. So first, the terms. The righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. And we know that's true, right? Remember something, there is no New Testament here at this time. This is about the year 50 CE or so, 55 CE. There is no New Testament. Oh, there's stories about the Messiah, but I bet you the Gospels, I don't think the Gospels were written by 50 CE. That's my personal opinion. Okay, there may have been stories floating out there and testimonies of him through, because of the apostles and so on and so forth. But as far as, written documents, what the people are studying or referring to, no. Okay, so what are they studying? They're studying the law and the prophets. That's what they're studying. And when they study those things, they see God's faithfulness in action. Okay? He says, even the righteousness of God through faith in Yeshua the Messiah for all those who believe. Now, so this is one of those really interesting phrases in Greek. So it says, pistis Jesus Christou. This is the phrase. Pistis Jesus free. And so some people translate it as faith in Yeshua. Okay, so now what does that do? When I use the phrase faith in Yeshua, what does that mean in your head?
That diminishes the Father.
Well, no, not necessarily. The Father and I are one, he said, the Messiah said, right? So it's, I'm not going to, but what does it mean, faith in Yeshua?
In many cases, it just means the historical figure, the name of Messiah, Yeshua, wasn't 2,000 years ago and died for my sins, and I believe in him, so he takes my sins away.
Okay, all right, very good. So the idea is that somehow I make some kind of mental assent to this person, Yeshua of Nazareth, and that in and of itself, that act, that thought, placing that is what takes away my sin. This is how God is fulfilling his promise. Somehow, it magically, or supernaturally, however you want to put that, it's that idea. That's what faith in, because Yeshua becomes the object of faith. In stating it that way in the English language, he becomes the object of faith. Yes? You understand what I'm saying? Are you following me?
Yeah.
I put my faith in him. I believe that he is whatever. And that saves me. Well, guess what? Who was it? James said, the demons believe that and tremble. So that in and of itself, believing that Yeshua says who he is, does not necessarily do anything for, at least for those dudes. Okay? So I can tell you that today's scholarship, beyond almost a shadow of a doubt, translates this in another way. They don't translate it as faith in Yeshua. They translate it as through the faithfulness of Yeshua. The faithfulness of Yeshua. So now it's not Yeshua as the object of faith, but as the faithful agent of God's promise fulfilling, if you will. In other words, Yeshua did something for you and me that resulted in our justification.
Amen.
He did it. I didn't do anything. He did it. You see, this is a much higher Christology than this notion of, oh yeah, I believe in that guy. Cool, I'm good. Now, I'm not saying we don't have to place our trust in him. We absolutely do. If we're going to receive the benefits of relationship with Messiah Yeshua, we must place our faith. We'll get to chapter 10 in Romans, before long. Okay? But right here, at this moment, as Paul is describing what it is he is describing, he is describing how it is that God fulfilled his faithful promises. He did it through the faithful action of the Messiah Yeshua. What did Yeshua do for you?
Can you repeat that? Yeshua is not the object of faith, but the faithful agent.
The agent of God's promise fulfilling.
Thank you.
Okay? So what did he do? So now I'm asking you all, what did he do? You all believe in him, right?
Yes.
So what did he do that you should believe?
He stood in place of us. Yeshua stood in place of us where we should have been condemned.
Okay.
He took our place
All right.
and gave his righteousness to us.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that. But he did do that. He did lay his life down for us. He took upon himself the sin of all mankind, suffered like no one else suffered, so that we would not have to suffer that, and allowed himself to be nailed to a tree as one who was cursed, so that we didn't have to bear the curse, because the curse was ours to bear. These are the things that he did in order that God might justify to himself a people for his name. So he becomes the faithful agent of God's salvation to mankind, to those who will believe. Okay? This is much more than, oh, gee, I like, yeah, sure, he's cool, he's a cool dude. All right? All right. So he goes on to say, even the righteousness of God through faith in Messiah Yeshua, or the faithfulness of Messiah Yeshua, for all those who believe, there's no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now that happens to be true. And it is one of the things that was indicated by Torah. It was. For sure. Let me ask you a question. If God thought that the Jewish people could obey the Torah perfectly, do you think he would have given them a sacrificial system so they could stay clean? A way for propitiation of sin? Yom Kippur. What do we do Yom Kippur for? Why do we have to have any of that? Was it just because of a future thing that was going to happen? No, because the book of Hebrews says that, the blood of bulls and goats, they cleanse you. God gave us that system because he knew we couldn't fulfill the Torah. So who's the numbskull who thinks that the Torah is there to make sure that you never sin? There's no way you make that conclusion if you read the whole bloody book. No one fulfills the Torah perfectly. That's why we have offerings for sin. That's why we have tshuva. That's why we have all of these things. Okay? So does it point to our failure? Yeah, it does. It did from the moment it was given. And it didn't take us too long to break it anyway. You see, so when somebody wants to grab onto an idea, through the law comes the knowledge of sin, as if that was its purpose. No, it just happens to be one of the byproducts of it. It's something you can definitely conclude from it. You see, it's the fact that people have caught on to these ideas and make them the centerpiece of a whole theology that makes it very difficult for people to understand the glory of what God did for us. We get sidetracked with stuff that's unnecessary. So let's try and focus. Let's try and focus on what God is doing for us. All right. Let's continue. So it says, okay. It says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, 24, being justified as a gift by his grace through the redemption which is in Messiah Yeshua, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. This was to demonstrate his righteousness, because in the forbearance of God, he passed over the sins previously committed. For the demonstration, I say, of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Yeshua. Okay? Now let's talk about, because this is the heart of it. So there are two terms that have to be defined and understood more fully than they have been in the past, in my mind. Okay? So those two terms that are used liberally in this short few verses are righteousness, which we've talked about, and justification. Two terms. Now, we've already defined righteousness as God's promise keeping, because all of the time when it's talking about righteousness, it's talking about his righteousness, right? It's talking about God's righteousness, right? This was a demonstration. This was to demonstrate his righteousness, because in the forbearance of God, he passed over the sins previously committed. For the demonstration, I say, of his righteousness, again, God's keeping his promises as at the present time, so that here's the promise that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Messiah. And the one who has placed his faith in that which Messiah Yeshua has done will be justified in the sight of God. And what now, the question is, what does justified mean? What do you think that means, people?
Before you justify, you have to be guilty, you know?
Okay, this is one way, in other words, this is one way in which the word justification is used. It's used in what we call forensic terms. It means like in a court of law, you're either guilty or you're innocent. So this is one way justification is used. So you were guilty and now you're innocent. Okay? So that's one way.
So your sins have been covered now. God can justify them. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you're justified and your sins are covered.
Okay.
With the blood of Yisrael, because he is the justification.
Okay. All right.
Our justification.
That's a way to look at it, as a forensic matter. I do not look at it that way. I look at justification as a covenantal term. A covenantal term. So what's the difference, you'll ask me, between what the forensic way of viewing it and the covenantal way of looking at it? So in the one case, justification means, okay, I've covered your sin. This is what you might say happened to the children of Israel when they sinned and they brought a goat to the temple and had the priest kill the goat and sprinkle the goat and the whole schmear, and now they were justified. Now they were cleansed. Okay, but that's not what justified them. You see, what justified them was God's sovereign act of selecting the Jewish people through Abraham before they ever did anything. Right? The children of Israel were chosen by God through no act of their own, nothing they did. God made, we don't know why God chose Abraham. We only know that he did. And that was an act of God's sovereign grace, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? He took the children of Israel out of Egypt as a sovereign act of grace. He brought us to the mountain of Sinai and made a covenant there through a sovereign act of grace. Everything that God has done for the Jewish people has been an act of grace. They are his people through a sovereign act of grace. Justification allows someone to come into right relationship with God. That's what justification is. It's not even an issue of guilt or innocence.
But sin separated them.
Right.
So the covenant was still in effect. But didn't they still need to be justified by? Yeah, didn't they still need the kapara, the covering?
Oh, always. They always needed the kapara, but they remained in covenant relationship with God. Let me ask you a question. All the sins that the children of Israel committed, listen, we go through the book of Exodus and we see how they complained about this. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to do everything, all these things that, time after time, testing the Lord. And then even through the books of, Kings and Samuel and all the evil things. In the end, what was the sin? What was the sin that drove them out of the land?
Unbelief.
No, it was more specific. Anybody?
If we look at Romans, it has to do with faith.
No.
No.
What was
When
the
they were
sin?
slaves in Egypt?
No.
You mean?
The sin was idolatry.
Yeah.
They abandoned God for another God. That's how they broke the covenant. They abandoned him. This was what drove them out of the land. You mean all those other sins, as bad as they were, and the prophets were warning them, you keep this up. The final straw that broke the camel's back and sent them to Babylon was the fact that they abandoned God in idolatry. First the 10 tribes, first the 10 northern tribes, and then Judah itself at the end. Okay? So, so God had a million reasons why he should have broken off the covenant with the Jewish people, but it was this one thing, which finally, and even that does not separate them permanently. He said he was.
Because you're talking about justification and the covenant with God and idolatry. I don't know.
Okay, but it's, well, because what I'm trying to clear up here is the meaning of the term justification. That it is not this simple notion of I was guilty, now I'm innocent. It's a covenantal term in that now one is in right relationship with God. This is what God did. This was what God wanted to do, to take those who were estranged from him and bring them close, bring them into relationship.
And what Paul seems to be saying is that the basis of that is faith. Now you can say it's the faithfulness of what Yeshua did, of his faithfulness.
No, but that results in our faith. So again, if we're going back to Romans 1:16 and 17, it's it says I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's what is it, the right power of God for salvation for those who believe, and then in verse 17 it says, verse 17 says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. And we talked about the meaning of that term as God's faithfulness resulting in our faithful response. So you're right. Yeah. We have to faithfully respond to it. Absolutely. Okay. And this is what I'm trying to get at, but I think we need to get everything in the right order. So when we're talking about where it says faith in Yeshua, up at the beginning of this sentence, verse where it says in verse 22, through faith in Yeshua, that's better translated. See Richard Hayes and his 400 pages on exegeting that scripture. Okay, the faithfulness of Yeshua. So there we're talking about Yeshua's faithfulness in doing what he did in order to accomplish the righteousness of God. And then when it says later on, for the demonstration, I say in this verse 26, of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be the just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Yeshua.
But I agree.
See?
What Paul was contrasting here in chapter 3 is righteousness from observing the Torah versus the faithfulness in Yeshua. And that what you're saying, salvation is not from following the law of Torah. Are you saying because it's the same for either Jew or Gentile? They're both justified in the same.
Okay. Again, following Paul's argument, he started in chapter 1 lambasting the Gentile world, just totally lambasting it. Right? They're all wretched homosexuals, crazy people, and all this stuff. Right? And they all deserve death. So he starts with that. And then he turns his attention to a Jewish person who's also there in that congregation. And he's saying to them, listen, is there, you don't think you're getting away with anything either, because either you're going to follow the whole law or you're not. That's basically what he's saying. Okay? And then the conclusion is whether Jew or Gentile, justification is through the same way. Right. Right. If we understand what justification is, which is a sovereign act of God apart from what happened at Sinai, actually. It's apart from, God justified the Jewish people first, then he gave them the Torah. You understand what I'm saying? He chose. It depends on what you're saying, if justification is a covenantal term, in other words, a relational term, it's not a forensic term. It's not a legal term. It's a relational term. Okay, so God first, he justified the Jewish people because of his love for Abraham. He made them his people. Then he said, because you're my people, and I have a special job for you to do. So in order for you to do that job, come up to the mountain with me and I'll show you what I need you to do. Okay? That's what he did. He gave them all those laws and all that other stuff in order to separate them from the nations so that he could have a place to occupy in the world.
I see.
Okay?
You're using justification. You're having different definitions.
I do.
than standard Christianity.
Correct.
That's why we're saying one thing, but it's meaning something else.
Yeah.
Until you
I-
realize that there's two different meanings of this word.
Correct. That's what
And
I'm
it makes sense.
that's what I'm saying.
Before it didn't make sense.
By the way, Paul uses the term justification 1,000,000 times in the book of Romans and uses it virtually no times anywhere else. Why? I mean, yeah, because he was specific to what he was trying to teach to the Romans. It wasn't his general issue, okay, in the rest of his letters. He had plenty of other opportunities to use it, he just didn't, okay? Because most of the time he was talking to all Gentiles. It happens to be in this time he's talking to Jews and Gentiles. So he has to clarify what he's talking about. But the unfortunate problem is you got a Hebrew concept that he has to translate into Greek, which we have to translate into English. And it just gets all muddled in the doing so. Yes, and by the way, only since the Reformation. Only since the Reformation. They look at it differently. And that's another point. Okay. So anyway, yeah, read Christopher Stendhal. He'll help you out. Now, having said all of that, I hope we're getting to the point where we're all getting on the same page about these terms. I told you this terminology is really the key to the whole thing, defining the terms. I knew it was going to come to this. This is why I haven't taught this bloody book all this time. I mean, it's just to get into this terminology is very hard. I know it brings up a lot of stuff because, people have been taught since the day they became believers in Yeshua that, this is what this stuff means. Okay. All right. So he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Messiah. Now that's where our response comes in. We have to place our faith in Yeshua. Without that, we don't get the benefit of it. Right? So there is something we must do. It's not like it's all, it's magic and everything is fine. Okay. All right. Verse 27 and following. So where then is boasting? It's excluded. In other words, nobody can, this goes to the Jewish guy who says, I'm righteous, And remember something, by the way, Paul says in another place in the book of Philippians, by the way, says, listen, as far as the Torah is concerned, I'm perfect. I mean, he said that. I didn't say it. I mean, that's saying a lot. Okay. So, but he's saying, you don't boast in that because that's not what Torah is for. Doing Torah perfectly gets you, might get you an attaboy, but that's about all you're going to get. Because that's not where justification comes from. Okay. Where's boasting? It's excluded. By what kind of law of works? No, by a law of faith. In other words, by placing your trust in the one through whom God fulfilled his promise. For we maintain that a man is justified by faith, apart from works of the law. Yeah. Look, again, the Jewish people are justified by their faith in God, not by the works of the law. But but the law is, doing the law is our faithful response to God. It's how we respond in thanksgiving to the one who justified us. See? Again, I'll remind you of Yeshua's own words. If you love me, you'll do what I command you to do. Even he asks for that. Right? Okay. He says in verse 29, now, and this gets to the root of why Paul is having this argument even to begin with, and going through this Jew-Gentile thing at the beginning, right? He says, or is God the God of the Jews only? In other words, if it was all by doing acts of Torah, then God must be the God of the Jews only, because only Jewish people can do that. Is he not the God of the Gentiles also? Yeah, yes, the Gentiles also. Otherwise, he's not God. He's just a local deity, and there are plenty of those, in ancient Rome, at least. At least they thought so. Since indeed God, who will justify the circumcised by faith, and the uncircumcised through faith, is one. Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law. So he's not trying to nullify the law in his argument. He establishes that God said to the Jewish people, I am your God, you are my people. This is what I want you to do as in our relationship. It's not that it breaks the relationship, it's just that this is our faithful response. God told us that we're kings and priests and all of this stuff, and that we should maintain it. Okay, we love you, God, so I'm going to do it. And now he's justifying the Gentiles through his faithfulness by saying, listen, my intention from the very beginning was to bring all of the nations together, so that I could have my abode among all the nations, not just Israel. You see? And by this, he establishes the law, because the law predicts all of that. Remember how it started at the beginning in verse 21? He said, but now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So now I'm showing you how it all happened through the faithfulness of Messiah Yeshua and what God has done. And so have we established the law? Yes. He proves his point. But that's not what he's saying here. He's not saying that. He hasn't even addressed that point at all. Remember something, again, well, remember now how he's talking. Okay, so okay, no. He's talking about faith. He's talking about faith. Yeah, it's all about placing our trust in God. That's what it's all been about from the get-go. And by the way, again, what's helpful here, and again, you want to study these things in depth. A guy like Stanley Stowers who does this sort of rhetorical analysis of the book of Romans. You can read it, the rereading of Romans. And in it, he talks about how in chapters 2 and 3, particularly, Paul is talking to two imaginary interlocutors, if you will, people that he's speaking to. The first one is a Jew, the second one is a Gentile. So he's turning to the Jewish guy and saying, "Man, dude, you're not getting away with anything." And then it says if he turns to this Gentile guy who's standing alongside of him and says, "Well, what about the Jews?" And he's going to get to that right here. He did it at the beginning of chapter 3, excuse me. When he says, "What advantage has the Jew, or what benefit is circumcision?" Great in every way. Because the guy was just listening to how he was ragging on the Jewish people in chapter 2, telling them how, just because you think you do the law, but you break the law, you're a breaker of the law, you're getting nowhere. Okay? So now you can imagine the Gentiles sitting along there smirking, you think you got some advantage, but And then Paul turns to that guy and says, "Oh, but there is a great advantage. But the advantage is not because just by doing deeds. It's by faith. Ultimately, it's by faith in what God promised in the law and the prophets." Okay?
And how does this play out, let's say, in the Roman congregation?
Yeah.
Did they become Torah observant in terms of?
Well, again, the answer. Well, no, those are anachronistic terms in the year 50 CE. Forget about rabbinical Judaism. There's no such thing as rabbinical Judaism in 50 CE. That's a much later thing. The Judaism of Paul's day was a different animal. So, but yes, did they have halakha? I'm sure they did. I'm sure they had traditions, the traditions of the fathers, whatever they called it. Okay. The point being is that's not what Paul is saying is prescribed for Gentiles. He's not relieving Jews of it, but he's not prescribing it for Gentiles either. Because by him saying, is God the God of the Jews only? He's saying, no, God is not the God of the Jews only. He's the God of Gentiles, and Gentiles are not Jews. They don't have to be Jews. Okay? So,
With respect to the faith, doesn't it one of the prophets I will write my laws on your heart?
yeah, well, that's Jeremiah.
By faith, we receive the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit gives us the laws within our heart that we're supposed to follow. And by faith, we follow them. So therefore,
Yeah.
we're not to go out and commit murder.
Okay.
Just because we have faith.
Of course, absolutely. Look, again, when we talk about what Gentiles should do, shouldn't do, blah, 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 I think what we have to recognize that see, I talk about it this way. I talk about precept and principle. I always talk about these two things. The precepts of Torah are for the Jewish people. In other words, with the letter of the law, that's what it is, based on our halakhic understanding of those things and how we're going to do them, we are obliged to them. That's the precept. But then there is the principle of Torah. And then the principles can be understood through study of those things. You study the law. When it says, don't lie, I mean, don't lie. When it says, for Jews, it says, you shall not plow to the corners of your fields. You leave them for the poor. Well, you can extrapolate from that, that we should be generous with what we have, that God gives us, gives us certain portions so that we can give to the poor. Can you make that assumption? Can you sort of think that out? I mean, any, decently normal human being can, gather that principle from it. And the same is true of many, many other things in the Torah. You study, and from that you get an ethical life. You can discern an ethical life that you should be living. And besides that, you have plenty of things in the New Covenant that say to you to do this, don't do that. And you can take all of that, and that becomes the law, if you want, or at least it becomes a way of life, the way, right? But the exact meticulous doing of halakhic things, that was for the Jewish people. That's all. That's how I would look at it. And that's more or less what I think Paul was driving at when he talks to Gentiles. Because in every one of Paul's letters, he gives you all this theology, generally speaking, he gives you all this theology at the beginning of his letter, and then then at some point, he goes, therefore, as a result of all of that, what should we be? Well, let me explain. And then he tells you, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. He's telling you. And most of it, you could look at it and say it's commentary on Torah. Study his letters, you'll see. It's plain. He goes into some deep theology, and then he tells you, listen, behave like a human being. And what a human being looks like is a person who, probably has studied the Torah and understood what God was driving at when he wanted you to live an ethical life. Okay? So no, he's not demanding that Gentiles become Jews. Definitely not. That would have been a violation of his understanding of what happened. That we live in the eschaton now, and that the Gentiles are going to come and be a part of God's people as Gentiles, not as Jews. Okay? All right. Well, that was more contentious than I intended it to be. But I understand. I want you all to understand that I know how contentious these things are, because these things have been read in a particular way for nearly 2,000 years, and particularly in the last 500-600 years since the Reformation.
I don't think as for Jewish believers that we are bound with all the minutia of Torah either, of where don't mix cotton with
Michael, I understand, but for us it's a different argument. For us, the way it works out is, as a people, we argue and have argued for 2,000 years or more about precisely how to obey God's commandments faithfully. And you know that there are all different views of that even today. You got Orthodox, there's ultra-Orthodox, you got conservative, you know.
Oral Torah superimposed.
Yeah, right.
Supersedes Torah.
I agree. And what is it? Oral Torah makes no bones about it. It's building a fence around the Torah. It's definitely saying, okay, here's the commandment, but we're going to build all these other commandments around it in order to protect you from it. And that's where the burden comes from. The burden comes from all the junk that you gets added to it that makes it all the more difficult to observe. I get that, believe me. So, but that's a different argument. You know, I mean, that's a different argument. Paul's not even getting into that with them. No, not at all. Not at all. Right now, he's trying to address how people, in my opinion, he's trying to address how people become part of the people of God.
That would be your definition, I forget, forensic, of
Justification.
How do you become part of the people?
That's right. That's my take. All right. All right, so he ends in verse 31 with, we establish the law. Okay, so let's get into chapter 4, even though I didn't give you the notes for it, and we got this far.
That's okay. We can read it.
Did I send out chapter 4?
No.
All right. Well, you'll just have to follow along with me. Well, these are my notes up there. Okay. Let me see something.
Just, can you just clarify your definition of justification? Just give us a definition that we can write down and comprehend.
Justification, definition.
On page 15 you wrote.
Did I write a definition for on page 15?
Something earlier, I thought
The third paragraph.
I think Teresa, you wrote it down. Didn't you, the definition for the justification?
Well, he has it on page 15 of the handout.
I do. Where did I put it?
Our justification, the justification of anyone, comes from an act of mercy by God and from no other source. No human work can justify men to God. Paul tells us that it is by a law of faith, not one of works. It is here that we have to be careful to define our terms, lest we fall into a supersessionist trap. By saying this, Paul is not indicating that Torah is meaningless or has been nullified by this law of faith. Rather, it is through trusting in the faithfulness and righteousness of God as manifest in Messiah Yeshua that one is justified, whether Jew or Gentile. For God is the God of all humanity. He does have a particular relationship with the Jewish people, which does involve the Torah and its written code and their obedience to it. In fact, their obedience to it constitutes their acts of faith, at least in part.
Just in a nutshell, it's basically
a relation.
Faith in
Right.
Yeshua.
No,
That's what the
no,
justification was.
no, justification is the result of our faith in Yeshua. In other words, that by virtue of our faith, our placing our trust in the work of Messiah Yeshua, we are placed into right relationship with God.
But you get that because the Israelites were justified at Mount Sinai, you said. So that was way before Yeshua. So
Yeah,
it's
right.
the relationships.
Right. But understand that inherent in the covenant that God made with the children of Israel at Sinai was Messiah Yeshua's sacrifice for them. It was already there. It was embedded in that covenant promise right from the start. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, again, let's get through this whole letter because you're right. It's more complex. But the question is whether or not God is faithful to his promises to all Israel. When we get to chapter 9, 10, and 11, we're going to see this. Because it's an obvious question that you're raising right there.
I mean, justification through Messiah Yeshua, and the Israelites are justified. Then there's a,
Okay, all right. There's some, right. So when we get to chapters 9, 10, and 11,
so,
Paul addresses the issue in detail. Because the question is an obvious question to be asked. Okay.
What you said, justification is the result of our faith in Yeshua.
Yeah, correct.
and in fact, maybe the Israelites' faith in God at Mount Sinai is the means of justification. If you're defining justification, in that. But this still comes down to faith, faithfulness.
Well, it still comes down to faith and faithfulness, placing our trust in God and what God is doing.
Because the justification at Mount Sinai would have happened before the giving of Torah, because then it was afterwards that the Torah was given.
Right. So the Torah is apart from that justification. This is the point. You know, the agreement that God makes with the Jewish people at Sinai is really separate from, in most ways, separate from God's desire to justify either the Jewish people or the Gentiles later on when Messiah finally comes. It's a separate thing that they're doing in order to maintain the presence of God in the midst of his creation, to be a light to the world, and to really, and it can't get away from it, produce the Messiah.
Right.
Okay.
That's what we were saying is,
Yeah, I mean, you know, so I mean, all of those things are going on.
Right.
Yeah.
God built the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Israel's destiny from beginning to end is the subject of, most specifically, of chapters 9, 10, and 11 of this letter. When he gets into it, he gets into it in depth, and we'll get there. Eventually, we'll get there. All right.
Just briefly, as I was driving here, I was listening to radio, and they were talking about, at the end, I didn't hear the whole thing, I heard part of it, but at the end it says, and there you are is the gospel of Jesus Christ in the book of Exodus.
Okay.
So they were relating Exodus to the gospel
Yeah, you can.
and to Yeshua.
It'll preach. You can do it. Okay. Let's just stick our toe in chapter 4. For this, I'm going to have to get to my notes, though. How come I can't exit the full screen and then reduce? You won't let me. Cannot while you're recording. Okay. I got you. All right, Faz, you're going to disappear on me. I got to get to my notes here. Okay. So let's read a little bit of Romans chapter 4. So what shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, is found? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, his wages is not credited as a favor, but what he's due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. Just as David also speaks of the blessing on the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven and whose sins have been covered. Psalm 32, I think. Mm-hmm. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. Is this blessing then on the circumcised or on the uncircumcised? On the uncircumcised also. For we say faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it credited? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, that righteousness might be credited. Okay? And the father of the circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but also follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had while uncircumcised. All right? This is relatively simple. It's relatively simple. Abraham and God had their relationship before circumcision. So again, he's saying that circumcision is not the thing, or following Torah is not the thing that justified Abraham before God. It was God. He believed God. God said to him, Abraham, I want you to go and, do this thing. And Abraham did it. Right?
And that's what justifies it. It's obedience and
Okay, yeah. He responded faithfully to God. In other words, he trusted the Lord, right? He trusted the Lord, and as a result of his trusting God, God said, okay, you're my guy. If Abraham had said to the Lord, I'm comfortable right where I am, thanks, but no thanks, we wouldn't even hear about Abraham. He wouldn't have been the guy. God would have found someone else, I presume, because the plans of God will not be thwarted by our unfaithfulness.
That's the whole point of this past 2 chapters is justification, right relationship as we're defining, is through faithfulness.
Yeah, believing it, trusting in God, and by trusting in God, that's all. And Paul could have said that in one sentence and moved on, but he's Paul. He doesn't do that. He can never say with one word what you can say with 1,000. That's his philosophy. And that's why he's confusing, and that's why 10 million books have been written about him, and people still don't understand him. It was hard. Look, Peter said he was hard to understand, and people today, I'm telling you right now, there is more confusion about Paul and his theology. And not to say that I know I got the whole thing down pat. I'm not saying. I'm just telling you. I'm giving you my point of view. That's what I'm giving you.
That's where the problem occurs.
Yeah.
And then now we're saying, no. You need the Torah in place in order to understand who Yeshua is and how to have faith in Yeshua. You can't do it in a vacuum. You have to have Torah there. But it doesn't mean that by following Torah that we're justified. No, it comes back to the same thing.
No.
I think that's
right. We're justified on the basis of faith. And I would argue that part of a Jewish person's faithful response is that we do our best, to follow God's will, for us, and he gave us a way of life in Torah, and we should do our best with it. That's all I'm saying. He doesn't require that of Gentiles, because if he did require it, I expect it of them too. But he doesn't. He doesn't. Okay?
I believe the Torah is for everybody. It's the constitution of the kingdom. And if you enter the kingdom, you have to learn how to obey God in all areas of your life. And if you want to be blessed, because the Torah is the blessing, it's not the curse, and God will, he wants us to be blessed and show his glory to this world. So why he keep somebody else's away from the observing of the Torah?
So let me explain what I think. I think there's a difference between people wanting to do certain things and having to do certain things.
Sure.
Okay.
Have nothing
okay.
To do.
All right. So I'm not going to tell a person. I mean, I think there are certain what we call signs or identity markers. You can make that argument. Some people do that are very specific for the Jewish people, like circumcision itself. Circumcision is a mark that you're in the covenant, thing. So there are certain things, but if a person wants to observe the Sabbath, if a person wants to observe the holy days, if a person wants to live a particular, kind of Torah life, and because they see blessing in it, knock yourself out. It's okay.
What do you mean wants to? It's comfortable for me or not comfortable? If I'm in covenant with God, I enter into relationship with God, so what's the covenant is? The covenant means it means promise to obey God.
Okay, but again, understand
not somebody else.
But you see, there are certain Well, I don't want to argue about something that the apostles already settled, 2,000 years ago at the Council of Jerusalem, when they said,
everybody
they said-
translated differently,
Yeah,
and interpreted the same way.
well, okay, you can
It's
interpret
a
it.
very questionable thing. Chapter
Or
15.
I'm going to tell you what the plain language says. The plain language says that Gentiles are not required to follow the Torah.
It's not the context of the Acts 15.
But they
It's
also,
exactly the
First of all,
context.
they argue about the salvation, the
Folks,
same thing.
I'm not going there,
about
guys.
the
No.
doctrine of the
When we do-
justification of
that
the
is
law.
another-
When we get there, we'll get there.
Gentiles
Let's
cannot
stay.
go out the Torah because it requires two witnesses to prove a point. The Torah is the first witness of the Messiah, and the the Gospel is the second witness. If you throw one of the witnesses out, you've nullified, you have no
That's an
Messiah.
interesting-
Okay,
All right.
wait a minute. I just want to say one thing. I remember when Rabbi taught Revelation, and he encouraged us to write our questions down, any kind of discussion, and God is a God of order, number one. And Rabbi is the teacher, number two. And I believe if we save all our questions till the end, write them down, hand them to Rabbi like we did in the study of Revelation, and there will be order.
Yeah.
And
I can-
Rabbi will be able
and I
to
can-
do what
and I can
God has
address
called
that.
him to do.
Because I understand how everybody's got an opinion, but most people's opinions are just that. There's an old saying, better to be silent and be thought a fool than to open my mouth and remove all doubt.
That's right.
So let's all live by that thing, okay? I get to study this stuff for about 20 hours a week.
We have 28 years study.
Okay. So let me share this quotation again on justification with you before I break something.
And you read it from page 15?
Page, no, this is my notes that I'm sorry I didn't give you.
Okay.
So Douglas Haring is a man who wrote a book called Paul Among the Post-Liberals. He's pretty renowned Pauline scholar, blah, blah, if you care about that. And he wrote this. He said, justification is a definitive cosmic apocalyptic act of the one God of Israel in Messiah Yeshua, whereby this God, through the death and resurrection of the faithful one, conquers the powers which hold the nations in bondage and reconciles the world to himself in order that he might create in Messiah a new people. Indeed, finally, a whole new world in which loyalty, obedience, and faithfulness to the one God of Israel is made possible among the nations in the power of the Holy Spirit. I mean, this is a brilliant definition. So again, this is just to fortify my example that this is relational rather than forensic. Rather than being, you're just declared innocent. It's about relationship. It's all about how God reconciles the world to himself so that he might create in Messiah a new people for himself. Okay?
What's his name?
Douglas Haring, and if you can wade through his work here, he's good. Okay? But he does say brilliant things every so often, I have to say. So, by retelling the story of Abraham and demonstrating that God chose Abraham and justified him apart from any action, right? That Abraham caused God to justify him. In other words, that Abraham did something that God had no choice but to choose. This is called election. Election is God's sovereign choosing for no other reason than God decided this is the guy. And God has the right to do that. Okay? God is under no compulsion to do anything you or I want him to do. He can do whatever he wants, any way he wants it, and he needs not justify it to any of us. So election. And moreover, that justification came to Abraham prior to his circumcision, demonstrating that his circumcision had nothing to do with the justification. And thus Abraham has become the father of all who are justified by trusting in God. This is the point of this section. All right?
The same about Noah. Noah believed God, but he didn't have to build an ark. But because of
We-
that relationship, he had the right relationship.
Right. He responded.
It's hard to say, okay, I'm going to build this ark.
Correct.
But the first thing that happened was the what we're defining as the justification, the right relationship.
Exactly. Now we're told about Noah that he was a good man before he ever builds the ark. He's a decent man. You know, I think something calls him a righteous man or something like that in his time. Remember, Noah was righteous in his time, which is always the argument that the rabbis want to make. Yeah, what does that mean? But so he was already a good guy, and God saw that he was a good man, and that he had a relationship with the Lord that pre-existed God's command to build the ark. But he still could have said no.
Right. Exactly.
He had the choice to say no, I'm not going to build the ark. But he responded faithfully to God. He heard the voice of the Lord, and he did what God wanted him to do. And it's the same thing with Abraham. One has to presume.
Right. It's the same thing that Paul's saying. It's just a demonstration of his faithfulness.
In fact,
Right.
Noah was mocked for building the
Oh,
ark.
nice.
He was mocked by his neighbors.
Yeah, he was in a
laughed at.
We're back to the believers.
Right.
It's normal thing.
So again, sum up this whole section. We'll get to the end of chapter 4 next week, hopefully. Is to talk about this idea of justification as God, as a sovereign act of God. This is what he's saying, right? Justification is the definitive, cosmic, apocalyptic act of the one God of Israel in Messiah Yeshua, whereby God, through the death and resurrection of the faithful one, conquers the powers which hold the nations in bondage. We're actually going to get into this more deeply too. But in order that he might create in Messiah a new people. This is justification, the idea. And this is what all chapters 2, 3, and 4 have been about, that it comes apart from Sinai. Paul wants to make that clear, that Sinai was not the point of justification. Sinai was Israel's response to having become the people of God. Okay? And because there's a dispute, you understand, let's go back to the root of the letter, that there seems to be some kind of a dispute between the Gentiles and the Jews in the congregation at Rome. And Paul wants to get at the heart of this, but before he can get at the heart of the problem, he has to establish some realities. And part of those realities are how indeed is one justified? And are the Jews different from the Gentiles in that respect? And he's arguing that the answer is no, that they're not different in that respect. Now, he doesn't nullify the Torah or the role of the Jewish people in God's plan of redemption for the world. We'll get to that again in 9, 10, and 11. But in the meantime, he wants to establish this notion that justification, getting right with God, is an act of God and his faithfulness, the faithfulness, this God's righteousness, which is revealed from faith to faith, from his faithfulness to our faithful response. Okay?
Who justifies? The accuser before the judge or the judge? The judge justifies because of the faith that we have put in the judge.
Okay. Again, we're going back to, we're falling back into the pit of a legal definition of justification rather than a covenantal one. You can't keep falling back into that trap. Of course, God is the guy. God is the one who is doing all of this, the justification. He's the one who's placing us into relationship with him. We're the ones who fell out of relationship with him, and he's the only one who could place us back into that relationship. Right? I think we can all agree with that. Right? So this is what it's all been about. How does that happen? It happens when the justifier, in this case God, says it's okay. When he says it's all right. Not when I do something that will make it all right. Okay?
Literally, the Gentiles didn't have a covenant.
Yeah.
So,
But they had a promise.
They didn't have a covenant.
No, but they had a promise.
I just wanted to find out.
Well, let's think about, we can think about it in these terms if we choose. God made a covenant with Abraham. So we call it the Abrahamic covenant, right?
Mhm.
And that covenant had 3 provisos in it, 3 general provisos. One, I'm going to make you great, Abraham, which God made. I mean, Abraham is the father of faith, right? I mean, for all the major religions of the world, he's the man. Okay? So God did fulfilled that promise to Abraham. He said, and I am going to make your family great. Okay? So even though the Jewish people are not huge in number, we've had an enormous impact on the history of the world, and we're still here after when there are no more Perizzites and Hittites and Hivites and Jebusites. So God is fulfilling that promise to Israel, although it's not completely fulfilled. Okay? Because I'll make your descendants as the stars of heaven. And then he made a 3rd proviso, and in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So there's a proviso, so yes, there is a covenant God made with the nations from the beginning with Abraham. Yes, and a promise that must be fulfilled. And again, all 3 of those promises are fulfilled in Yeshua. All 3. So yes, to answer your question, yes, they do have a covenant. And of course, the new covenant applies to everybody.
The question that I got was, when the Gentiles are grafted in through Yeshua, are they also grafted in to the covenant with Israel?
Oh, okay. So the answer to that question is there's nowhere it says there. Well, let me say it this way. Let me just repeat the language of Paul, and we can interpret this another time because we don't have enough time to get into this fully right now. But in the letter to the Ephesians, Paul says it this way. He says, therefore remember that formerly you Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you are at that time separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Messiah Yeshua, you who formerly were far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. So the question is, to what have they been brought near? Well, obviously, if we go back to the predicates, we go back to the commonwealth of Israel. That they were excluded from the commonwealth of Israel. So now they're included in the commonwealth of Israel, whatever that means. Whatever that means in Paul's mind, the commonwealth of Israel. Okay, now what's a commonwealth? A commonwealth is, so a commonwealth, if you're going to use that terminology, and I don't know what the Greek here is, I have to be honest. The commonwealth in modern terms is an association, right? Like the British Commonwealth, if you will. So we have all these countries that have a common language, have to a certain extent common customs. There's a certain relationship which exists between those groups, which make them one large family, if you will. So this is what I think Paul is maybe driving at. That he's saying you have been brought near to Israel, so that you share in Israel's blessings, because he does say that. He says that later on in the same letter, the Ephesians. He says, by referring to this, when you read, you can understand my insight into the mystery of Messiah, which in other generations was not made known to the sons of men, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and the prophets in the Spirit, to be specific, that the Gentiles are fellow heirs and fellow members of the body and fellow partakers of the promise of Messiah Yeshua through the gospel. In other words, the Hebrew scriptures didn't predict it was going to happen quite this way. At least nobody interpreted it that way. And now we see what's actually happening. That you Gentiles are being brought near to Israel. Not to replace Israel or even to become Israel, or Jews, but to share. Yeah. To share in the inheritance, to share in the blessing. Just like it says to Abraham, and in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed.
Didn't
So-
leave us out.
That's right. Never had an intention to leave it.
Isn't the
Well,
That's the church. The Gentiles, as they're referred to in the church, is the only body of believers that referred to as the body of Messiah, Yeshua. And I've never seen it referred to in terms of speaking of Israel. But the church.
well, that's the church. That's true.
They are their own distinct.
Well,
entity.
that comes from replacement theology, because at some point or
I don't
another,
believe in
I know you don't, but
and I don't think that comes from replacement theology.
well, no. Well, let me explain
Scripture, it's such a thing.
well, because they weren't making those kinds of Paul, particularly, wasn't making that kind of a distinction between the Jewish ecclesia, if you will, and the Gentile ecclesia. He wasn't. No, I don't think he was. He wasn't trying to make any kind of distinction about that. But he also wasn't saying that the church was Israel.
Right.
Okay? So what happened later on in Christian thought was that the church, as an institution, replaced Israel. It replaced Israel's election.
I know that
completely.
It's true, but
Okay?
My
So-
question to you is, are the two mutually exclusive? In other words, if there's a
No.
body of Messiah, does that automatically mean that they replace Israel?
No.
Because that's not what it means.
No. No, I don't think so. No, again, listen, this is me. I believe in what we call bilateralism or bilateral ecclesiology, the notion that because Paul says, again in the book of Romans, that the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable to Israel.
Right.
So Israel, even though Israel is an unbelief, corporately, is an unbelief, nevertheless, they're still his people by virtue of election. And so they constitute one of the bodies of the people of God. So the people of God, and then you have the people from the nations who have come to faith in the God of Abraham through Messiah Yeshua, that we call the church typically, also belong to the people of God.
But I just wanted to make a
All right.
distinction.
And that God will reconcile all of this in the end. This is why Paul says at the end of chapter 11, that in that day, after after the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, all Israel will be saved. So, obviously God has plans for the fulfillment of his promises to his people.
Also, when this book was written to Jews
I understand.
and Messianic Jews. And Christians were not in the Bible. The Christian church was not.
Well, the
Bible.
church, as we understand it today as an institution, wasn't there. But Gentile people were, obviously a
Yes.
part of the Hebrews, of the new covenant, for sure. Yeah. Listen, folks. Yeah. All right. This has been more contentious than I wanted it to be, but it's okay. Iron sharpens iron.
Yes.
So let's all just, let's try and understand what Paul's trying to do and try and define terms. I just want you to know where I'm coming from, whether you come from that direction or not, that I come from, everybody has let me just explain it this way. Everybody has a starting point, a hermeneutical point of view. Nobody comes to any text or any situation utterly neutral. Nobody, under any circumstance, in any circumstances. So we're all going to come with certain presuppositions. My presuppositions, I'm being as transparent about my presuppositions as I can be. They are that God's covenants with Israel are everlasting. And he has not abandoned his people. That the Torah is an eternal covenant that God made with Israel. He says it too many times in the Hebrew scripture, this is eternal. So I assume eternal means it's the same as it did then. Okay. So I assume those are my assumptions, that the early church, or the early Jewish believers in the Messiah Yeshua, based on what we can ascertain from the Gospels and from the book of Acts in particular, were faithful to those covenants as best they understood. They did not abandon them when they became believers in Messiah. Okay? Those are some of the most important assumptions I come to the text with. And that Paul himself was faithful to Torah, because he says it right at the end of the book of Acts. He said it himself. So these are my assumptions. So when Paul says something that seems antinomian, something against the law, I have to say, wait a minute, let me read everything that he has to say about it so I can come, because I have, if I'm wrong about all of this, then Paul's a hypocrite and I shouldn't even be listening to him. Okay?
Paul's faithful to the law, but he eats with Gentiles. So we have to think that he's not eating kosher food, right?
Right.
So, but yet he doesn't say, well, no, I've abandoned the law because I'm not eating kosher food. So there's somehow we have to put those two things together.
That's right. That means that his ability to eat with Gentiles is based on something else, not food, not what they're eating, but something that has happened to the Gentiles that makes it possible for him to eat with them. And that's what happened. That's what happened in the Galatian incident. And what his argument with Peter was about was that Peter was saying that these Gentiles are unclean. Not that they are eating the wrong food, but they themselves are unclean because until they become Jews, they can't be purified. That's what he was saying. And that's why Paul went into, had a conniption fit. He said, these guys are clean just the same way we are by faith in Messiah Yeshua.
And that's how, when you started the study, when you talk about this, theologian doesn't get it. That so it wasn't about food, it was about that we don't recognize you as clean.
Clean, yeah, exactly. You're impure. Right, when God has purified all of these things. And Peter even said it. Peter said it in another place, and yet he forgot about that when these guys, whatever the pressure was on him. And that's why Paul calls him a hypocrite. This guy was saying, oh, he was a heretic, accused him of heresy. I defy you to go into the book of Galatians in chapter 2 and see where Paul calls him a heretic. He doesn't. He says, you're a hypocrite. There's a difference between a hypocrite and a heretic.
So what Paul is arguing is the Gentiles are justified and made clean.
Right.
Themselves.
Right.
Doesn't matter what they eat.
Right.
And that's what this.
That's right.
This is what this theologian you brought up.
Yeah. He doesn't get it.
He's just thinking and this is about who you are. I don't accept who you are.
And this is what, because he comes, and I'll argue it because he comes from a certain set of assumptions. He has
he's viewed as unclean.
He has a certain set of assumptions that influence his ability to draw conclusions from text. Everybody does. All I'm saying is everybody does. I get that. I have mine. I'm just letting you know what mine is. Now you can either say, Rabbi, you're nuts, and you're coming from the wrong point of view, or
go back
whatever.
to the beginning. The whole study to get back to the beginning to understand what you're saying.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I'm going home.
You take a nap.
I need a drink. All right, guys. Let's have a word of prayer.